Good morning and welcome to payroll. Afternoon. We are starting on chapter 2 today, which is identifying and talking about how you calculate gross pay. And I think there's going to be a lot of information in here that's going to expand on what we've already talked about. Can somebody give me a quick refresher on what the FLSA is? What are the major provisions? Yeah, it was the first time that we had a minimum wage standard in this country, right? What else? Another biggie, two other biggies. Minimum wage. Yeah, overtime, exactly. You can only work 40 hours a week before you have to be paid overtime. And lastly, it basically sets standards for child labor. Okay, so those are sort of the huge provisions of Fair Labor Standards Act. So we're going to unpeel that a little bit more, look at that in some more depth. This seems pretty intuitive, like the number of hours I worked was the number of hours I worked, but there's actually a number of complexities to that we're going to take a look at, like prepping to do your job or follow up to your job or waiting in line to pick up a paycheck. Is that time you get paid for or not? So we need to learn about things like that. We're going to do a little bit more look at record keeping. And then number 4, we're going to spend quite a bit of time doing some calculations and then looking at different kinds of compensation plans. Okay. So basically, the Fair Labor Standards Act, this is a tad bit confusing, but you know how I've said all along that all these different acts only apply to certain groups or certain kinds of companies? Well, the Fair Labor Standards Act has 2 types of coverage. It has enterprise coverage and individual coverage. And enterprise coverage is only for employees that work in a company that engages in interstate commerce. What does that mean? What's interstate commerce?
Inside the state.
Not inside the state, it's between states. So it's moving either like raw materials in or finished product out or any combination thereof. So if you don't engage in interstate commerce, you're not going to be covered under enterprise coverage. So I'm a little cherry orchard up at the Flathead. I pack and sell to some local vendors. I'm probably not engaged in interstate commerce. And you have to have 500,000 or more in annual gross sales. Additionally, lots of nonprofits, regardless of their sales volume, are included here. So you can see right away, if you're not in interstate commerce or you're really small, like under 500 grand in sales, you're not even covered under this part of the act. If you're not covered under that part of the act as an individual, you may be covered here. So it's like I'm not directly involved in a company that does interstate commerce, but I'm in a fringe occupation. So like I drive a fleet that transports products back and forth, or I make crates that actually moves the oranges from Florida to Alabama. So that's like a fringe occupation. But the point, I guess, of all this is right down here is that lots of small family local businesses are essentially exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. So technically they don't have to what? And they don't have to comply, so they really don't have to pay minimum wage. They don't have to pay overtime. They're exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, there's state laws they have to comply with. In Montana, we have a minimum wage state law, don't we? But just be aware that not everybody is covered by FLSA. This is basically just talking about how you define an employee and an employer. And the reason this is so critical is there's this whole other class of workers called what? If you work as a consultant for somebody, you're not their employee, you're their independent contractor. Ever heard that term? What do independent contractors get at the end of the year? Do they get a W-2? No, they get a 1099, don't they? And they are, as you were asking, I believe last week, Kelly, they're considered to be what? Self-employed, so you're paying both sides of that, which tax? FICA. Yeah, FICA. FICA is the term for both Social Security and Medicare, right? So Social Security 6.2, Medicare is 1.45. Together they're called FICA. So that's why this is so important. An employer, or no, that's a typo. That should say an employee is an individual who acts directly or indirectly in the interest of an employer. If I'm self-employed, I act in my own best interest. And you're an employee, if you perform services in a covered relationship, they can be common law, which just means that they're traditionally accepted in common law. It's not in the statutes. Or the IRS, and we're going to be talking a lot about this, so you should tap into these three terms because we're going to be using these all semester. The IRS looks at determining whether a party is in an employee relationship or an independent contractor relationship based on three things. How much behavioral control do you have over the person? Right? How much financial control do you have over the person? And what does everybody think the perceived relationship is? So if you come to work for me and I'm like, so you need to show up at 9 o'clock and here's the tools you use and here's the process you go through and then here's how you do your quality control at the end of the day. Probably you're what? You're probably an employee, right? Because I've got clear behavioral control, right? Versus you come to me and say, oh, you need your chimney swept or your bricks pointed or your roof repaired, and I'll get to it when I'm done with my other clients, and I've got my own tools and my own processes, and I don't have much behavioral control. Well, we're going to see in this class that there's lots of gray areas. It's not usually so black and white as that. Okay, so what does the Fair Labor Standards Act say about domestic help? I'm sure most of you go home to a staff at night, right? Nannies and cooks and chauffeurs and all those good things. That's what domestic help is. So they're covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, which means what? Need to be paid minimum wage, overtime, need to be covered under workers' comp, FUTA and SUTA, need to cut them a W-2 at the end of the year, right? It's very much a compliance issue that's, I don't know, I've seen stats that say 20 to 25% of people that have domestic help actually comply with it. So basically the overtime and the minimum wage rules apply if you work 8 hours a week or more, or you earn at least $1,900 in a calendar year. Live-in domestics do not need to be paid overtime, so if you have somebody actually living in your house, you don't have to pay them OT. And direct care workers, these are folks that are doing health care in the house, or if you're disabled or whatever the case is, you've got a direct care worker. They are also subject to minimum wage. And this is really big business. My sister-in-law and her husband live in New York City. They both have giant jobs. I mean, they pay their nanny $45,000 a year. And they W-2 her and they cover her for health insurance. And why? Because they want to keep her. It's just like whenever you want to keep good health, right? So the compliance around this is a pretty big deal. But it's fair. I mean, this is what these people do for their living. There's no reason they shouldn't be treated accordingly. Okay, so is minimum wage just the cash I pay you? Are there other things in that calculation? Or the hourly wage I quote you? It's pretty much everything. So if I give you commissions, or I give you bonuses that are non-discretionary, in other words, if you perform at this certain level, then you get another 40 cents a unit you produced, or another 3% of your gross paycheck. If I pay you differential for being on call. So let me just make sure you understand the difference. A non-discretionary bonus versus a discretionary bonus. So discretionary bonuses are not included when you're calculating minimum wage. Non-discretionary bonuses are. Non-discretionary means it's just totally agreed upon in the contract. It could be a labor contract, it could be a employment contract. If you attain X level of performance, then you get another 3%. That's non-discretionary. A discretionary bonus is, I own the company, y'all work for me, we have a great quarter, and I take y'all out for lunch and say, we had an amazing quarter, I'm giving each of you $1,000. Right? That's discretionary. The expectation isn't necessarily that that's going to happen again next quarter. Okay? So that $1,000 that I just gave each of you, I don't get to include that when I make sure I'm complying with minimum wage law. These guys, I do get to include. You understand that? That's a very important thing that we'll come back to when we do our calculations. Because at the end of the day, I need to add up all this stuff and divide by your hours and make sure I've got you at minimum wage. Other kinds of things that are not included as well in your regular rate of pay, if I give you vacation pay, profit sharing, if I give you an allowance for your tools, or I give you mileage reimbursement, none of that comes into your minimum wage calculation. That's all in addition to. So you've got to be really clear when we go to make sure we're complying with the Fair Labor Standards Act, what's going into the calc and what's not going into the calc. So I was supposed to look this up and I didn't.
That's right for the federal.
It's still a 7 1/4 for the Fed.
805 is the
Montana. Yeah. Okay. That's kind of what I thought. But okay. So, and it hasn't changed for a really long time, like 6 years or something. So when you hear about all this stagnation of the middle class, most of it's around this. Why is there so much resistance then to raising the minimum wage in Congress? I don't know about you guys, but I can't imagine living on $7.25 an hour. I mean, never mind $7.25 an hour with somebody else to take care of, like a kiddo. Why is Congress so resistant to it? And I don't know about you guys either, but going to the grocery store is just I'm like, oh my God, did milk really go up 50 cents a gallon in a week? I mean, it just feels mind-blowing to me. So why are they resistant? Because really, what does it do to folks that have kept long-term jobs with very little movement in wages? Is at one time they could be considered, middle-class folks, and now I'm in your poverty level, clearly poverty level. What's the problem? Does anybody here have an argument against raising minimum wage?
Only because people who are getting degrees, like the Washington minimum wage state wage to like $15 an hour.
In Seattle, great example. They raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour in the whatever the name of the county is.
Right. Seattle. So, you think about people who are getting degrees, they might as well just go get a $15 an hour job and make maybe $2 less than what they.
So, are you Haley or
Yes, Haley. That's Hannah.
Forever, I'm just going to think of you as the 2 H's, so forgive me. And it's what Haley's talking about is wage compression. So we all have degrees, we all make $18 an hour, and then they raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and I go get my coffee and pay the person in the service station, money for my gas, and they get $15 an hour, and I've got my master's. I'm feeling like I need to be making $26 an hour. So it's wage, it's pressure, it's just wage pressure or wage compression, it's called. And so the worry about that is, of course, that just has to filter through to something, and it filters through to the price we pay for products. So it spurs inflation. That's the worry against minimum wage from an economic standpoint. There's lots of research to show that that's not as pronounced of an impact as people think, but I really want us in here there's so many of these issues are pretty controversial social issues as well, and political issues, and I think that you should all be sort of questioning them and interested in them as, young business students and just citizens too. So, versus what's a living wage? Anybody heard that term? I mean, don't read it off of here. Anybody heard that term? A living wage is a calculation that says, what's the bare minimum you need to make to live in this particular community? So it's just an analysis of, gas, housing, food, utilities, what have you. And it's going to look really different. In San Jose, California, it's something like $20 an hour because, a studio there is $3,000 a month, right? They did a calculation here in Missoula, and I'm going to say it's been a good 7 or 8 years ago, and it was like $9.80 an hour. And that was quite a while ago. So I can guarantee it's probably closer to 11 or 12 bucks an hour now.
Yeah, when I was working for a company called Independent Inspection, we tested power poles and all that. Here in Montana, I was making like $19 an hour, and then we go to Washington.
Because of the living wage provisions. So I'll be honest, living wage provisions are usually found in pretty progressive areas, right? They're not found in conservative areas. Montana on the whole, they say we're a purple state, but on the whole, these kinds of provisions don't gain a lot of traction in traditionally conservative places. But basically, the other thing people don't really understand about living wage is it doesn't mean everybody's going to that level. It generally starts with people that are engaged with some sort of company that's in a government contract, which you would have been, obviously contracting with some sort of government entity, probably, or PS, or like, the Public Service Commission oversees them. So it doesn't mean the guy in Starbucks is moving up to living wage. It's people that work for companies that have some sort of government contract or affiliation. So, and then it says here, obviously it's a law that attempts to keep low-wage workers' wages on track with the cost of living. There's about 100 cities that have it now. It did not pass in Missoula. We put it in front of the voters. It was pretty close, but it did not pass here. And to my knowledge, we don't have any living wage laws in Montana. Okay, tipped employees gets kind of convoluted. So anybody here been or currently are a tipped employee in Montana? Okay, what's the rule here for minimum wage for tipped employees?
We report, or the one I was doing, we reported it was 20%
Of your gross? Of your gross sales? So how much do you have to get paid as a tipped employee in Montana? You have to get regular old minimum wage, $8.05 an hour. For people that have worked in other places, like I went to grad school in California, I worked in Tahoe in the summers tending bar, $2.35 an hour. That's minimum tipped wage in most places. It is extraordinary that here in Montana you get $8.05 an hour plus your tips. I mean, that's quite a living here, actually. Okay? So just be aware that minimum tipped wage, oh, did I say $2.35? It's not $2.35, it's $2.13, sorry. $2.13 an hour. $2.13 an hour. That's all they've got to pay you as far as cash. So I worked for Harrah's Casino. My gross pay for 40 hours a week was $86. Okay. So what does that mean? It means that you've got to show as the employer that your employee is getting $5.12 an hour from someone else, i.e. their customers. Why? Because $2.13 plus $5.12 is what? Minimum wage, right? Minimum federal wage, except for in Montana, it's $8.05. But, okay, so here's how it works. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you this. It's somebody, a tipped employee, somebody that regularly gets tips. It's not like you get the random tip. I mean, it's like I'm a regularly tipped employee, like I'm a cosmetologist or a bartender or a, masseuse or something like that regularly gets tipped. So for the employer, this $5.12 an hour that you don't have to pay your employee because your customers are is called your tip credit. Okay? But it's still your responsibility to ensure that they're getting that $5.12 an hour. How much do they have to make altogether? $2.90 a week, right? Is minimum tipped wage, so that's a different state law. Okay, interesting. Now, for anybody working with a federal contractor, minimum tipped wage is $4.90, and that's on a schedule to go up every year. So you can see a lot of these laws too, rather than being perpetrated on everybody in private industry, it starts for companies that contract with the government, and then it will infiltrate into private industry. So basically how this works, you have to report your tips. And in the old days, I mean, we actually did them on pieces of paper called 4070s. But now most companies, you have some sort of checkout system where you have to input your tips before they'll let you cash out for the night, right? So they accumulate what you say your tips are. So say that in 1 week I work in a little coffee shop up in Troy, right? And I report $43 in tips. Well, that's not a good example because we're in Montana. Let's say Troy, Wyoming, where the minimum tipped wage is $2.13. The first thing I have to do as the owner of the coffee shop is make sure that my person got to how much for a week? $2.90, right? So I've got to pay her $2.13 an hour, which is only $85.20. Plus her $43, do I get her to the $2.90? No, of course not. So I've got to pay her an additional $247. I can't cut her a check for $85.20. See how that works? Any question on the math? What if now I'm, running drinks at a blackjack table at the Bellagio in Vegas, and I made $1,189? Does the Bellagio still have to pay me $85.20? They do. They always have to pay me that $2.13 an hour. I'm obviously way over the $2.90, but they always have to pay me $85.20 an hour. Obviously, they don't have to make anything else up. What's going to be the problem with my taxes in this situation? Do I pay tax on that $11.89? Sure. Is that going to be able to come out of my paycheck? Not even kind of. I've only got $85 of gross to absorb my taxes.
Unless they collect it. I worked at one where they collected it and then just gave it to you. You actually keep the tips tonight. Is that right?
That's not legal.
Collect it all and then give it to you
They
with a
can't do
check.
that. Absolutely can't
So
do that.
then-
Oh, I know. There's things I hear in this town that are like, you're kidding. Yeah, companies do things in ways that suit them. That doesn't mean that it's above board. So how does my waitress at the Bellagio get even on her taxes? What's she going to have to do? She's going to have to make quarterly estimates. Anybody ever heard of that? You know what that is? Most of us pay our taxes how? How do you guys pay your taxes? I pay it through my paycheck, right? They take them on my paycheck, and then I get even with the IRS at the end of the year. If I'm this gal at the Bellagio, once a quarter, I actually, like Amber said, you better be smart and have a savings account that you're putting like 30% of your tips into, because you're going to have a big estimated payment you're going to have to make. You pull the money out of your savings account, put it into your checking account, and actually write a check to the IRS 4 times a year. Okay. Okay, still in the FLSA, overtime provisions. You can set up your work week any way you want. It can be Tuesday through Monday or Friday through Thursday or whatever you want, as long as it's 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. Otherwise, they're worried that you're going to mess around with changing the work week to try to get out from underneath overtime. This is interesting. Some states actually require overtime on a daily basis. So any day that you work over 8 hours, you get overtime. So for example, that's a law in California. That's a problem in a lot of urban areas where a lot of companies are trying to go to 410s, right, to kind of keep traffic and commuting minimized. If you've got somebody that you've got to pay overtime to, if you do that in California and have them on 410s, you're going to be paying them 8 hours a week of overtime. Okay, that's not a law in Montana. I think there's like 4 or 5 states where they do that. Overtime is at least 1.5 times regular pay. So companies can, if they choose, and a lot of companies do this, especially like on Sundays or swing shifts or whatever, you can pay double time or 2.5 times your regular rate, but you have to pay at least 1.5 times for overtime. So the first question one of the questions a lot of people ask is, can the employer require overtime of the employee? And the answer is, yeah, they can. They can require you to do that as a part of the job. There are some exceptions to this 40 hours. If you're a hospital employee, you only get overtime once you've had 80 hours in 14 days. And there's special rules if you earn commission and you're in some sort of retail, and if you're receiving remedial education. You don't see these last two too much, but this is a pretty important one. Okay, comp time. How many of people have heard of this concept of comp time? What does it mean? Basically, it's used as a term to say, well, if you stay an extra 4 hours on Friday night, then you don't need to come in Monday till noon. Okay? Can I do that? Why not? You're shaking your head no.
Well, if you miss your hours.
Yeah, I can't do that because that first week you worked 44 hours. The fact that you're only working 36 hours the next week doesn't even out and make it all fun, right? So comp time, and I've heard this so much, is so abused just simply because I don't think employers are doing it purposefully necessarily. I think they just don't know the regulations of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Comp time only applies to emergency medical responders. Emergency medical responders, and that's really about the only people that can get comp time accrued. Otherwise, if you work overtime, you've got to be paid for it. And if you're one of these folks and you do have accrued comp time, if you retire or you're terminated or whatever, you've got to be paid out your comp time. And the comp time is paid out at 1.5 times your regular rate. The formal term for it is compensatory time off, but most people call it just comp time. Okay, this is really, really, really important. Exempt versus non-exempt employees. So what we're talking about here, if you were going to fill in this whole sentence, would be exempt versus non-exempt employees from the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, i.e. overtime, minimum wage and overtime. Some employees by nature, and we're going to see who they are in a sec, are exempt from the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which means what? I don't have to pay them minimum wage, and I don't have to pay them overtime. Who's exempt? What kinds of people do you think are exempt from minimum wage and overtime? Well, if you're self-employed, yeah, this isn't even really an issue because you're a family business at that point. Who's exempt? Do I get overtime? Does anybody ask me to turn in a time card and then they go, oh my God, you worked 65 hours last week, let me give you overtime? No overtime. Okay, that's what most people think. Oh, you don't get overtime because you're on salary. Is that the issue? It's not. The issue is not how I'm paid. The fact that I'm on salary has nothing to do with the fact that I'm exempt. Exempt employees are based on your classification. Professional, executive, administrators, outside sales, creative and computers, and business owners. These are the categories of people that are exempt from the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. It has nothing to do with whether I'm paid hourly or salary. So what I'm saying is, could I be salaried and non-exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act? Sure. So it's basically white-collar workers, and you should know Figure 2.2 because this is really, really critical, for a lot of you going into sales and marketing or entrepreneurship or business management. These are the very, very real issues you're going to have when you hire people. So there was just a lawsuit that went all the way, I think it went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was basically a class action suit, and I think it was through Best Buy, but it applies to any, big box store, of low-level managers at a Best Buy. They were working like on average something like 65, 70 hours a week. And they were exempt under, I don't even know which one, I think that they were, I don't know what category they were even claiming exemption under. Maybe as executives because they have manager in their name. But when you work for a big box store, do you get to choose your inventory or your marketing or what you're selling or how much of it to order or where to store it or what to price it at? I mean, it's all policy and procedure driven, isn't it? And so what they were saying is we don't have any discretion in how we do our job. So they call us a manager, but we're not really an executive. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they actually found in favor of the employees that, in fact, they were non-exempt. Okay, so they had to be paid overtime. That changes a lot of the models of the big box stores, doesn't it? Okay, so this is really, really critical because here's this Figure 2.2, which you're responsible for, that indicates exempt status. And you can see in most of them, it has something to do with you've acquired some special knowledge in your field or you have some discretionary power in how you do your job. If you go somewhere and it's just a prescriptive, like here, do this and then enter the data there and then process this and then file it here and then do it all over again, but I call you my chief administrative, officer, you don't have discretionary power. So just because they give you a title and put you on salary does not make you an exempt employee. I really want to make sure everybody hears what I'm saying because for self-advocacy purposes, because this is something that's abused a lot, right? I put you on salary, I give you a fancy name, and then I work you 50 hours a week, and I say, oh, you're exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. Well, no, you're not. Not if you don't, have advanced knowledge or use discretion and independent judgment, or you've got the ability to hire, fire, and promote people, right? So you've got to go in and look at what these categories really are. You've got to be paid at least $455 a week to qualify as exempt. And lastly, blue-collar workers are always entitled to overtime pay. There is no exemption for folks that are considered blue-collar workers per se. And then again, just to reiterate this very important point, putting someone on salary does not mean he or she is exempt. So I'm going to ask you this a bunch of times over the course of the semester. What does exempt versus non-exempt mean? And then it even shows up on the final, and I can tell you, like, historically, 1 in 5 of you will get this right on the final. The term exempt versus non-exempt does not apply to tax. It does not apply to, it doesn't apply to anything else we're going to study. The term exempt employee versus non-exempt employee only applies to the Fair Labor Standards Act and this idea of, do I have to be paid overtime or not? And that's one of those things, just like independent contractor versus employee, that's going to keep coming up and up and up because in the real world, they are huge issues. Have any questions? Child labor, so we're still talking about Fair Labor Standards Act. Child labor basically says that you can work at 16 or 17 as much as you want, as long as you're in a non-hazardous job. If you're 14 or 15, you're very, very limited in places that you can work, like food and gas, and you can only work limited hours after school and on weekends, and X amount of hours per week. So it really identifies child labor. It does talk about agricultural. Kids as young as 10 and 11 can work in this country legally for hand harvest, but only between July 1 and October 15th. Other than that, in general, employing somebody under 12 is illegal. And this is obviously subject to really strict provisions, and you have to have a certificate of age on file. Okay. What aren't you required to do as an employer? We've just been looking at all these things that you do have to do. What aren't you required to do? And a lot of times people didn't know this necessarily. The Fair Labor Standard Act does not require that an employer pays for weekends or holidays extra. It does not require that you're given any paid off holiday or vacation. And it does not require that they grant you any vacation time or sick time, or give you holidays off. A lot of times people think, oh, these are my rights. No, they're not. They're all benefits. If your employer does that for you, that's a benefit. They're not required to give you one single solitary penny of paid time off in any way, shape, or form, or holidays off. Those are all gifts or benefits. Okay, so this is back to that original kind of introduction where we were talking about how do you determine how many hours somebody really worked. So basically, you have to be paid for all of your hours of principal activities. Principal activities refer to anything that you're doing for the benefit of the employer. So pretty straightforward. But there's some really interesting situations where people say, well, I had to come in an hour before, Denny's opened to turn on my grill. But then I wasn't really doing any other prep and they didn't want to pay me. So those are the kinds of things that, go to court. Or there was a lawsuit against, who produces the microchips? Intel. I don't know if any of you have ever seen how microchips are made, but they're in these big sterile bubbles and everybody's in sterile cloths or sterile uniforms. And it takes like a half hour to get through all the chambers between where you get changed and where you actually go on the line and start production. The bunny suits. It's really actually super interesting to go in one of those factories and see. It's just like everybody's kind of like ghost-like. But they didn't want to pay the workers for that half hour it took them to get changed and through all these chambers to the line. So these are the kinds of things that are going to court. Basically what the courts are saying over and over is that anything getting you ready for your principal workday is also compensable and considered, you've got to be paid for it, considered compensation for compensable time. So getting in and out of protective gear, coming in early and turning on your grill, getting your metals heated up so that you can start welding. Whatever it is, that's part of your principal workday, and it's for the employer's benefit. They've got to pay you for it. Also, travel. This is worth talking about for a second. So do they ever have to pay you to get to work, for your time to get to work or home? That's called commuting, right? So that's never compensable. But say that I go to work and I pick up my client list for the day. I'm a home health worker. And then I travel and I take care of all you guys during the day, and I go from your one home to the home, to the home, to the home, to the home of the next person. Do I have to be paid for my travel time between the homes? Yeah, because that's a part of my principal workday, right? But the time it took me to get to, say, my first home, to Olivia's home, do I have to be paid for that? No. Or coming home from Hannah's? No. That's commuting. But everything in between, I have to be paid. Additionally, if I'm asked to go to a work site that's off of my regular route, so to speak. So let's say I'm a project engineer and I always go, into downtown Missoula to work. And now for a couple weeks, they're requiring that I go to Darby to meet with one of our subs for something. Do they have to pay me for that time to go to and from Darby outside of my regular work site? Yeah. So normally commuting's not included, but in that particular case, it's an exception and it is compensable. Idle time and wait time, this was another lawsuit, I can't remember who it was. I think it was Motorola. The line would go down or the equipment would go down or the service people would come in to calibrate the line. And then they'd make the line workers punch out while their equipment was being worked on. It's not like it's my free time and I can go do anything else other than sit here and wait for my machine to come back up. So any idle time or waiting time, again, that was for the employer's benefit, right? So they've got to pay me for that. If you get a break that's less than 20 minutes, they can't make you check out. In other words, it's compensable. If your breaks are longer than 20 minutes, then they can make you check out. Additionally, this doesn't say that they have to give you a break. It just says if they do give you a break and it's less than 20 minutes, they can't make you check out. If they do give you a break and it's longer than 20 minutes, then they can make you check out. But they don't have to give you a break. That's not part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Meals are generally not compensable. In other words, they can make you check out for it unless you can't leave your workstation, like I man the phones. So, okay, here's your lunch hour, but you still kind of got to watch the phones or the front desk or whatever. Well, no, if I'm not going to be paid for that half hour, I want to be able to go run an errand or go share a quick sandwich with my kid at preschool, right? So if they make me stay at my desk or my work site, then it is compensable time. This is a biggie as more and more companies are paying people in their homes. In other words, they're sending product to people. It's for like envelope stuffing or assembling products or boxing products for shipping. If you work in your own home, by nature, everything you do is a principal activity, and you're non-exempt. So what does that mean? Overtime, minimum wage, compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Sleep time is actually considered a principal activity if you've got to be at work less than 24 hours. Well, who goes to work and sleeps? What's an example of that? Yeah. But doctors are always going to be exempt because they're professionals. Firemen are always going to be exempt because they're blue collar. What about, no, this is actually talking about somebody that goes and punches in and sleeps for most of their shift. Yeah, it's mostly care workers. It's like if you work at the youth homes or you work at an assisted living facility or you work, when we were in grad school, my husband worked in a youth detention facility where, you would have to go and you'd have to do checks every couple hours, but other than that, you were sleeping. Or, at the youth homes where you go stay with the kids at night, make sure they're safe, everything they need, but you're basically, you're punching at 11, leaving at 7, you're probably sleeping most of the time. So you've got to be paid for that. It's called your principal activity if you're at work less than 24 hours.
Oh, I thought you were talking about like literally going somewhere and sleeping, not during the sleep time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a swing shift, but it's your principal activity. Like if you read a description of somebody going and working like in a youth detention facility at night, your job description is to ensure the safety of the residents, be there for an emergency, make sure, lights off and get the kids up and get them going in the morning, and then you're off most of the time, probably 6.8 or 6.9 hours of that. 8 hours is intended to be sleeping. Huh?
You shouldn't be.
Well, no, it's assumed it's assumed that you will be as long as you meet the protocol, like every 2 hours you need to get up and do rounds. Training sessions, if your employer says you've got to come to a training session on your own time, that's compensable. Waiting for a doctor's appointment on site, that's usually for a urinalysis. If you're waiting to have a UA, I guess that went to court. You know, I had to sit and wait for 45 minutes to get in to pee in the cup so I could get back on the line. That's compensable time. What isn't compensable? Basically anything that's not customary or contractual. You're waiting in line to actually hit the clock, check in and out of the plant, that's not compensable. If you're sick, they don't have to pay you. If you're tardy and you get docked for your time, they don't have to pay you. And then this is kind of interesting, fractional parts of an hour. So if I show up at 8:02, can they not pay me until 9 o'clock? Do they have to pay me for the full 58 minutes between 8:02 and 9? Or can they do fractional hours, like an hour split into 10% increments, 6-minute increments? They do. And you can be paid for fractional hours. The issue is my fraction of an hour is 30-minute increments. So you show up at 8:02, I'm not going to pay you till 8:30. Well, one court might find that to be, viable, and one court might say, oh, that's not going to fly. So there's diverse rulings on what the smallest amount of time is. I think in Montana it's 6-minute increments. You have to pay in 6-minute increments. Okay, what do you have to use for timekeeping? FLSA requires, obviously, that you maintain some sort of timesheet. That doesn't really look, for most of us anymore, like the old, I'm old enough that I remember actually hitting the yellow cards in the clock and, putting them in the slot. And I worked in bars and restaurants my whole life trying to get through school. So do people still, I'm sure they're still out there. Most places now have some sort of digital system, or you log on the computer, card generated, even more sophisticated, people going into things like web-based or biometrics, eye scans, retina scans, thumbprints, log on, remotely, web-based, anything like that. So there's a lot of new ways, but you've got to have something in system, some system in place that if the Fair Labor Standards Act comes and says, show me that this is a involatile system, that it can't be tampered with, you've got to be able to prove that the system is solid. Okay, well, we did get there, good. Okay, so probably want to get out calculators and pencils. If you want to get up and give a stretch, because I know talking for me for 80 minutes is a lot, and for you probably sitting there listening is even more. Maybe I'll open this just a tad. Okay, so what we're talking about here, and this is all really based on making sure you're complying with the Fair Labor Standards Act, is looking at folks that are non-exempt but are salaried. So, like, who would that be? Who's non-exempt but salary? You gave the example of firefighters. Put you on a salary, but you worked 55 hours last week, and you're not exempt. So what do I have to worry about? How am I going to calculate overtime and get you your overtime? And there's just a number of steps we're going to have to go through to figure out how to do this. Okay, first off, let's just go through the 4 most common ways of being paid, because there's different denominators in our calculations that we're going to look at in a second based upon how you're paid. So what are some traditional ways to be paid? Every what? every 2 weeks. What's that called? Bi-weekly. If you're paid every other Thursday all year, 2 months a year you get how many checks? Yeah, I love that scheme because you learn how to work, live on 2 paychecks, but then twice a year you get 3 paychecks, which is like, woo, bonus month. Okay, that's called bi-weekly. How many times a year are you paid if you're bi-weekly? How many? Go ahead. 26 times, right? 52 weeks divided by 2. So bi-weekly, 26 times. I'm going to put the screen up in just a sec. I just want you to think about these. Okay, so every other week, that's bi-weekly. How else can you get paid? Weekly, which is how many times? 52. Or monthly, which is 12. Or, what's the other pay scheme? Semi-monthly, which is twice a month. How is that different from every other week? Yeah. It's like I get paid on the 1st and the 15th. Or like my husband gets paid on the 5th and the 21st. Okay, it's semi-monthly. How many times a year are you paid? 24. So obviously students get what and what confused. Bi-weekly and semi-monthly. So just make sure you understand the difference and that you know that when you see bi-monthly, what's your divisor, your denominator? How many times are you paid? 26. Oh, wait, what did I just say? Oh, did I? Okay, I'm sorry. Let me confuse you more. Okay, so semi-monthly is how many times a year? 24, and bi-weekly is 26. Thank you. Okay. The issue is that in a bi-weekly paycheck, it's the same, right? 80 hours a paycheck. And weekly, same, 40 hours a paycheck. But obviously monthly and semi-monthly can be all over the place depending upon what day of the month, the beginning and the end of the month lands on. Like this year is a leap year for February, so we've got 29 days, and right, so you can see there's different hours every month. The way the book teaches this essentially is they handle it differently for different pay types, but I think that's way more confusing. I think it's better to just do it one way for every kind of pay type, so that if you do the same 5 steps I'm going to show you every single time, you're always going to get to the right answer. So we're going to kind of do this my way, but these slides are produced for everybody around the country, and of course it has to comply with the book. So just bear with me a little bit, because I think it might be a little confusing at first, but I think I'm going to make it easier at the end. Last just little point before we launch in is that you can have different pay periods for different kinds of employees in your company. Like here at the U, professors are paid monthly and staff is paid semi-monthly. So you can do that, but you can't go into staff and say, you get a semi-monthly check and you get a monthly check and you get a bi-weekly check. So groups of people in your company have to be paid on the same scheme. But you can change it up for whole groups. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to just jump through this. And this. Okay. So basically what we're trying to do here is convert your salary to some sort of hourly rate, because I need to get that to do what? To make your overtime rate. So let's just go through these 5 steps and see if you kind of understand what this means. So if I tell you that I'm paid $1,000 a week, how would you annualize my salary? Yeah, you take 1,000 times 52, I make 52 grand a year. If I told you my salary was $2,000 and I'm paid bi-weekly, 2,000 times 26, same 52 grand. Okay, you get that. So that's the first step. Annualize the salary. You need to pay a lot of attention, obviously, to how often are you paid? Because that determines what you multiply the number by to annualize, right? Step 2. Here they say calculate regular weekly gross. Well, that doesn't make sense to me because what if I'm paid semi-monthly? Why do I need the weekly? So in our little world, or if you printed out the slides or whatever you're doing, step number 2 should say just calculate the regular gross. So stick with me here. How would we do these 2 steps if I told you I'm quoted probably just write these in your notes and see if you can run this out for me pretty quick. If I'm quoted $4,200 a month, but my company cuts checks bi-weekly, what's my regular gross paycheck? What'd you get? That's not what I got. How many times are you paid in a year if you're paid bi-weekly? You all just sat here and fell. I got 1938.46. Did everybody get that? If you didn't, and when we work through these numbers, do not be shy to be like, I don't know where the hell you're at. Because if you just sit there and smile and nod at me, I'm going to be like, oh, she's dead on. So make sure to tell me if you're not getting the numbers that I am. Because also, like, sometimes I get wrong numbers. So we need to all be consensus. Okay, 1938.46, regular check, right? My regular paycheck. Okay, let's pop back here. The next thing says calculate hourly pay. 1938.46. Here's how you do that. To calculate the regular hourly pay, I always go back to the annualized salary and divide by the number of hours in the work year. So first off, what was my annualized salary again? How much? Annualized. Yep. How many hours in a work year? Figure it out. Think about it for a second and then tell me how many hours are in a regular work year, full-time work year. $2,080, 52 times 40. You count, so you don't take vacation or paid time off or holiday or anything into that. Okay? So therefore, what do you have this person's regular hourly wages at? How much is this guy making an hour? $24.23. Yeah, sold. Where do I sign up? That's the regular wage. Can you easily get to his overtime pay now? What does he make an hour for overtime? Okay, so 24.23 times 1.5. And so we do traditional rounding, 5 or up, you go up, right? So $36.35. Better yet. Okay, now I want you to figure out his bi-weekly paycheck in a week or in a pay period where he worked 83.75 hours. My board always gets a little squirrely over here. It doesn't calibrate on the right side, so that's what that's all about. 83.75 hours. What do you know that he makes for his just base? Yeah, I'm going to start with that 1938.46. That's his regular gross paycheck, isn't it? Then do you know how much he makes per hour for overtime? Yeah. And do you see how many hours of overtime he had? Yeah or no? Yeah, okay. Is that what y'all got or close? Okay, so I took 36.35 times, right, which is his overtime pay. How many hours of overtime? So I think he made 136.31 of overtime, and his regular check's 1938.46, right? 2074.77. And I will always be generous with rounding. So nobody's getting hung up in micro pennies. All right, let's go back and see if we can do this and replicate it a couple times over. One of the things I want you to do when you work through these, please, is to make sure that you write out the equations. I see some of you just doing it straight on the calculator or whatever. There's pedagogical theory that shows the more we actually manually go through and do things, the more solidified it is. So I want you to actually write the algebraic equations out. Okay, wait, this is not supposed to all come up at once. All right, I'm just going to go put this on a... All right, let's try this next one. I got to go look at the facts real quick again. Okay, this time, I'm quoted $1,500 a month. I'm paid weekly, and in this pay period, I worked 43 hours. Let's just go around. Bo, what's the first step? Okay. So you're writing the equation down. What are you actually writing down for your annualized wage? Count. How do you know what to multiply it by? Yep. Yep. So everybody go ahead and write that down. That's totally correct. 1,500 times 12 is going to give me his annual salary, right? This would be a classic example of working for. Okay, so, and then actually I'd even like you to label it if you would, please. Okay, Josh, what's the second equation? He'd get his regular gross paycheck. How often is he paid? Okay, and so what am I going to do? What's my calculation actually look like? 180?
So,
Wait, sorry. Isn't this right? 18,000. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. The next question is, what's his regular gross paycheck? And Josh said he thinks the calculation is 18 grand divided by what? Right. And you might even, as you go through these, circle these facts, because the first one we had to multiply by 12 to get the annual salary, but now we're trying to figure out how much he makes every week, because that's how often he's paid, right? What's his weekly paycheck then? Okay, and then I want everybody to label this. What is the $346.15? What do we want to call that? Yep. And let's just use the same term over and over, regular gross, right? You're paid weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, same concept. So my label is regular gross. Okay. Amanda, what's the next calculation?
Calculating the hourly
Right. How much does he make an hour?
for an hour, $8.65.
Okay, but what's the calculation? What are we all writing down? And don't forget that I want you to always go back to the what? Annual salary. In this case, you could easily divide by 40. But could you do that if he was semi-monthly? Why not? Is semi-monthly the same number of hours every time? No. That's why I'm showing you Lisa's way instead of the book's way. Because this way that I do it works the same every pay type. So the question was, what's the next calculation? Amanda, what is the next calculation?
I did it by the weekly amount instead.
Okay, but what would you do if I wanted you to go back and pick up the annual number?
I would take the annual number and
Divide it by, and let's actually say this together, the number of hours in the work year. The number of hours in the work year. And remember that, I'm not just saying 2,080 because you know what? Some people's full-time work year is not 2,080. Like I'm only contracted for 1,400 hours a year. So if you were trying to do this for me, you wouldn't put 2,080, you'd put 1,400. But for a 40-hour-a-week regular person, my denominator here is what? Yes. And I really want you writing out exactly what I've got up here. This is total reinforcement. How much is he making an hour? $8.65? So I mean, obviously this is your check for minimum wage too. Do you have a question? What am I going to label that? $8.65 per hour. Regular wage. I know you're like, I don't want to read this shit over and over. Yeah, you do. And you want it lined up just like I've got it. For those of you that are creative thinkers, this is probably straining your brain. Like all this linear stuff and perfect and balancing and double underline. For people that are accountants, this is like, oh, sigh, this feels so good.
Took Tim's class.
Okay. Accounting is not the place for creativity. That's why we draw and bead and quilt, and play music and things like that. Okay, what's next? Brooke? Overtime. Uh-oh.
What did I do there?
Huh.
Touch something.
Okay, fill in the blank and then label it, please. How much is it?
Well,
12. And what are we calling that? Good. Okay. I'm just going to leave all that data up there. I want everybody to write out the last algebraic equation and get me his gross pay. Then we'll do one more for reinforcement and call it a day. That's what your equation should look like. Don't be lazy and forget the parentheses, because that guides the order we do stuff mathematically, right? Everyone get 385.09? In accounting, when we get to a big number or a grand total, we double underline it. That lets us know, like, yes, this is what I'm working with. This is going to be what we figure all our taxes on, and our 401k contribution, and our, those are the biggies. Taxes and 401ks are simples. Okay, let's do one more for reinforcement. I'm going to put the date up and let you do this on your own. Well, technically, these are supposed to only come down. Okay, it's doing that. Okay, next one, last one. Here's my data. I'm quoted a salary of $2,000 a month. Then I work. For those of you online, you can go find the answers in the slides. This is example number 2. And we'll pick back up on the second lecture on Thursday. Bye.